I want to lead us into a consideration of what we want for our children and young people, how we as a society balance their entitlements with keeping them safe and healthy, educating them, and making them ready to be adults in their turn. My role as Children's Commissioner for England rests on the notion, recently confirmed by the Secretary of State, that children and young people need advocacy, and that it should be provided by somebody who does that work on a statutory footing. Moreover, it rests on the notion that they need such advocacy most when they are least reachable, least easy to hear and to support. As Commissioner, then, I am a statutory national champion. The post, campaigned for over many years by many organisations working with children and young people, sets out to lead policy debates about them and to speak from a position of moral purpose and leadership. My post was created with the backing of all three main political parties, and it's matched by similar but not exact replica posts in the UK's devolved administrations, most European nations, and many further afield. We are currently under review. Speculation is running alongside its bedmate rumour about what we might look like after John Dunford reports his findings to the Secretary of State, a process that's expected to complete in late November, which will be followed by whatever changes in legislation might be needed to change what the Commissioner is and does. Those in my office and I can't help but wonder too. But we leave rumour and speculation to others. We have given our formal submission to the review team. It's on my website, which is an open site. Please go and read it. And so we just get on. There is work to do. So I comment, the Office of the Children's Commissioner reports, and where the voice of the child indicates it's needed, I call for change on children and young people's safeguarding, their health, their education, their citizenship, and their economic well-being. I do so for all 11.8 million children in England, but must by law have a particular regard for the most vulnerable, those who are marginalised. I'm unique because I have the right of entry into any setting where children and young people are deemed cared for except their homes, to seek their views on how they should inform policymaking. I reflect those views back to those in power in localities and central bodies. I'm not empowered to take up individual cases or complaints. Where there's evidence from children and young people, I can institute an inquiry, but I first must speak to government. I intervene in court cases that set precedents or could stand as an exemplar, and courts take those interventions seriously. They are often quoted in summing up and judgments. My vision is probably much like yours, wherever and however you work with children and young people. My priorities are woven through with the voices and views of those children and young people. My planning starts with what they tell me, and as Children's Commissioner for England, I consider so should yours. However difficult it may be to remember that children and young people are a population in their own right and rights holders in their own behalf. Children and young people should be actively involved in shaping all the decisions that affect their lives, supported to achieve their potential, with access to appropriate services, which they also have a hand in shaping, living in homes and communities where their rights are respected and their responsibilities learned, where they are loved and safe, and enjoy their lives as citizens now. So I press for a routine that if a policy is about them, children's and young people's views are asked for, listened to, and acted on. When I ask, they should be able to tell me how they know they make a difference to how services work, including by exercising their right to complain and to have those complaints taken seriously. By law, I bring children and young people's thinking into policy making, increasing our understanding of their interests and their views. Most of the time, it's an uplifting and positive experience, opening adult and young eyes alike. Now and again, it is uncomfortable. No less necessary and ultimately rewarding for being so. I won't go into the detail of what we're working on as a small but influential organisation. My website is packed with information, and it's the proof of how we engage both with research and with policy to exert influence. We publish what we find. In our work, we try to enhance the way this country makes policy about and engages with its children and young people. We do blog. By some mystery, we do tweet. We're linked to a lot of other organisations right across the sector. When necessary, we work with the research community. We comment on policy and practice in the media, both mainstream and the sector's media. And I'd be delighted to have anybody in this room explore what else we do and to what effect, and still more pleased if you could continue to engage with us. My central aim is that children and young people experience improved well-being because they take an active part in all of the decisions made about their lives, so that they recognise and enjoy their rights under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UNCRC for short, which the United Nations adopted on the 20th of November 1989, so it's almost 21 years old. The then UK government signed it in 1991. It is the United Nations' most signed international treaty. Not the ones about guns or aid or food or drugs, the one about children. I nearly said yippee, but I know I'm being filmed. Only the United States and Somalia have yet to sign it. We have signed it, but I am not convinced we know exactly what it means. Or rather, we understand quite well what we mean by the child, but we're less convinced about, less aware of, the deeper meanings of the word rights in connection with children and young people. We're certainly uncomfortable with the notion that children and young people have rights. Too easily, born of that unease, we become involved in stereotypical debates about whether children and young people have rights, and if so, whether their having them negates adults' rights or leaves children proclaiming they know their rights as an excuse for their bad behaviour. Our discomfort as a society then deepens, and all too easily we find we cannot have a calm discussion about the matter. The issue forms the basis of the remainder of my address, and I hope the discussion that follows. We are bound also by the European Convention on Human Rights, which lives in our legislation in the Human Rights Act. There are tenets in both of these that apply to the dignity and the appropriateness, including the age appropriateness, of our treatment of children and young people. For these instruments, a child is under 18. We've some questions to answer about the under 18 population, who seem, as they frequently tell me, to be children when we decide they are, and adults when we deem it convenient. Our children and young people should experience being understood and valued by adult society. Those I meet, around 3,000 since I came into post across every region in England, say consistently that they want to value and understand it in return. Improving intergenerational understanding lies at the heart of both their and my concerns. The UNCRC is the key benchmark for how we as a society work with, raise and live alongside our children and young people. We signed it under Mr Major's government. We're bound by it as a states party, whether or not we have incorporated it into law. Anybody who works with them or whose work affects their lives should look deliberately for opportunities to fulfil its articles. Some of them, of course, are about basic human rights we surely all believe in: to a name, to be safe, to hold a belief and not to be prejudiced against for holding it, to be loved and nurtured. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child holds us to account for how we are doing it every 5 years and challenges us to do more where we're found wanting. I want to run some articles and their implications past you in a short while, but I shall only look in detail at some of them. If I give you the headlines of others, I hope you'll reflect with me that we have many opportunities as the Convention celebrates its 21st birthday to cement in place what it challenges us to do. Let me give you one very big headline to preface what I say. Rights, including the rights of the child, are not sitting somewhere waiting to be earned. They are a given. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child is crystal clear. When we signed it, we made our children into rights holders, as well as still being developing, often vulnerable beings who need protection and guidance from adults. These twin statuses are profound in their implications. But just to reassure you, youngsters I meet say they're equally clear it is not about putting children in charge or subjugating other people's rights to theirs. I've met youngsters aged as young as 6 and all over England who say very clearly they recognise that if they have rights, so does everybody else. And as they also explain, we are mutually responsible for ensuring everybody enjoys them. I've had children and young people in some very tough places in this country, some of them very damaged, some of them in all sorts of trouble, who can patiently explain to me that if all you do is grab what you think are your rights, irrespective of or deliberately denying those of the people around you, it is not likely you will enjoy the rights you've seized, because what you're doing is doing somebody else down in order to claim them. To the Convention in just a bit more detail then. Some key articles to consider. I only want to look at some of the overarching principles articles, and then I'll narrow down onto 2 areas of current policymaking where particular ones apply. If we take the Convention and its United Nations general commentaries off the shelf, know some of its details as well as its headlines, and ensure what happens to our children and young people through it and through the frameworks such as the EU Charters and the United Nations Human Rights Convention, we can explain where necessary, we can defend how we treat our children and young people. If you saw on television last week any of the United Kingdom Youth Parliament's debates from the Commons, I'm sure you will reflect with me that's all they're asking for. An opening word of advice as you read the Convention if you're a first-time reader. Change the sometimes emotive word rights into the rather less contentious but I think deeper word entitlements in your head, and you are perhaps closer to the meaning and the tone of the Convention. Article 2 says the Convention applies to every child regardless. Moreover, that they don't actually have to do anything to have the Convention apply. It's a gift. Article 3 says everything we do must have the child's best interests at heart, and if that means adapting so we come at what we're doing through the eyes of the child, so be it. Given they're all different, as we are, the demands of that article on our practice are not to be underestimated. Article 4 says children and young people are entitled to rely on the adults in their society to protect their rights and ensure they are fulfilled. Children and young people, especially the most vulnerable, are likeliest to be voiceless in a society that, for all sorts of reasons, takes an adult view of how life should be and how policy and laws should apply to and regulate it. Article 6 says every child has the right to develop and have the maximum chances to do well in life. That's all of them, including the ones who are hardest to reach, hardest to understand, hardest to accommodate, even those seemingly in possession of or holding firmly down a working self-destruct button. Article 12 says children and young people have a right to have their voices heard and taken seriously in all the decisions that affect their lives. That means all children and all decisions, not only where services are child or young person specific. So, what their neighbourhood's like, what regeneration and other changes might mean for them, what their adults are talking about when they discuss, for example, the legacy of the 2012 Olympics. Children and young people have opinions on these and far more. Properly guided and mentored, they can and do add hugely to what adults decide. So here's a plug. I encourage everybody here to make it possible to hear children and young people's views through our work on participation and involvement. Last year, 30,000 children and young people and 1,000 organisations, from small businesses and public sector bodies, the Bank of England to Tesco, took part in the Commissioner's Takeover Day. It does what it says on the tin. Children and young people are brought into places where decisions are made to work alongside the adults who are making them. It's not too late for you to help thousands more to take over this year on Friday the 12th of November. On my website are all the support and ideas and forms and everything else you need. Please do it. All you have to do is sign up. The world's longest paper chain is about to be made on the 12th of November by 8,000 children and young people in Hertfordshire. I can't wait. It's going to be fantastic. Please do it. The Co-op is, the Bank of England is, the Met is, Boris Johnson is. You should. All plugs aside then, there's a tough challenge in Article 12. It means what it says. All children and young people with a voice in the decisions made about their lives, even if they can't have what they want once their voices have been heard. Even if there are difficult conversations entailed in explaining why not. Our research on how well we fulfil this article leads us to know we are weakest in our delivery with those who have the harshest messages to give, those who are hardest to listen to, those who have naught for our comfort. They are the ones with disabilities, those with health problems, those in the youth justice, immigration and safeguarding settings, those who live in poverty, those who are isolated by the circumstances of their birth or where they live, including in remote and scattered rural communities. And remember, there are some children tonight in England who will be experiencing many of those, not just one. Article 13 backs Article 12. Children and young people are entitled to freedom of expression as long as they're within the law. You'll recognise this article is central to the Human Rights Act and to our commitments to Europe and the UN. We haven't formally incorporated the UNCRC into English law, but it's a binding international treaty on which we are held to account. It relates directly to legislation that drives social cohesion and community. But freedom of expression granted to our children isn't necessarily something all of us are comfortable with. Read the general commentaries. The right is unambiguous, but there's a recognition that children and young people need to be brought up in a society that teaches them how their entitlements should not eclipse or negate those of adults they live alongside. We live in crucial, some might say, rather over-busy policy-making times, do we not? I want to focus, therefore, on two groups of UNCRC articles that apply to two topical areas of the policy landscape and share my reflections on them with you before making some closing remarks and going into the conversation. Those two areas are education, on which subject we'll be launching our first publication on Friday this week, and youth justice, a vital area for all 4 United Kingdom commissioners and for us especially in England and Wales as we wait for a Justice Green Paper at some point before Christmas. Education first. Article 28 and its commentaries say all children are entitled to an education in a safe and respectful environment, including one where discipline is clear. Article 29 says that education should be in the round, respecting the pupil's personality, needs and talents, and including teaching them respect for the adults and culture around them and the society in which they live. An education, then, that is about being a human being, as well as being ready to pass one's exams. So I welcome the report from Sussex University on the UNICEF website only today on the rights respecting schools. Rights respecting schools teach rights, respect and responsibility, and the Sussex University report indicates a drop in bullying, absence, difficulties, mental health problems, poor relationships, and a growth in parental involvement, better attainment, better attendance, and a school as a community. I urge you to read it. It's very good stuff. Articles 28 and 29 are the ones we need to keep an eye on. as we go through considerable changes underway in the system, but also look at the continuity that's likely to persist in state-funded schools. More than schools might need to change if the convention's to be fulfilled. In Sweden, whose models are clearly influential in current thinking, my opposite number there confirms all school inspections include interviews with pupils without adults present, who are asked UNCRC-based questions on how well the school respects and helps them to live out their rights under the Convention. The same inspectors have the power summarily to close schools, whose practice falls short. As the Swedish Commissioner told me a month ago, they don't hesitate. An interesting potential development, perhaps, for a future inspection model in an ever more diversified English system and in its regulation. We're partway through some research with the NFER on pupils' take on these issues, so do look out for further commentaries from us. 2 other articles that apply to education, 23 and 26. 23 says a child with a disability has a right to a full and decent life, to developing independence in a system that respects their needs and talents and helps them fulfill their potential. This article applies the challenge to the system and to every school where they're present, whether their difficulties are physical, sensory, learning, or a mixture of them. As a former director in local government, I never encountered what has been deemed by some of late as a bias to inclusion, unless that inclusion was properly planned with appropriate adaptations and staff training. When all of them are in place, when it's appropriate for the individual and the school, inclusion of children with a very wide range of challenges can be, and schools across the country daily prove it is, successful. But those conditions have to be satisfied. Article 26 is a companion, but it also applies more widely and states families in any kind of need are entitled to additional support. I am not about to get us involved this evening in a debate about what that might mean in a climate where such support may be in ever shorter supply. What I do consider is vital is that we are careful to monitor and to recognise the effects in practice of changes in welfare, housing, education and benefits on the lives of those who are described by Article 26 of an international treaty we have signed. They're in our schools and communities now, they're already worried, they will still be there when the effects of the policy changes go live. We must keep a careful eye for the effects and be humble enough to change course, to review matters so we avoid failing to fulfil the Convention's requirements. Youth justice then. Don't we have difficulty in having a calm and consistent debate about children, especially those aged 11 upwards? The reasons appear complex. For example, there are parts of the media that, regardless of the facts, continue to tell the majority of us we could deem ourselves frightened but fundamentally fine, as the medics deem us worried but well, that we've reared an entire generation up to no good. Prejudice breeds suspicion, leaving an abiding stereotypical fear that a group of young people clustered under a streetlight outside your front door with their hoods up, because that way they can read their digital screens and it's November so their ears are cold, are actually planning the crime of the century. Or that, as one 17-year-old told me in March, the fact I'm with a group of my friends on your street obviously means we are an organised crime syndicate. Actually, it just means I'm having a night off from being a young carer. I've just got a lot of friends. My counterpart in Northern Ireland undertook a survey in which under-11s in the media were universally portrayed as angels and those aged 12 plus were demons. Clearly, in the summer holiday between leaving primary and starting secondary school, they emerge from a cocoon and become monsters. London government undertook a survey last year. The key question, what percentage of adolescents do you think are engaged in crime, especially violent crime? This great city's denizens said 30%. Ladies and gentlemen, that's 540,000 teenagers running amok across the capital. The actual percent? 1. Now, this demonisation tops the list of youngsters' issues raised with me. It's part of my current business plan to address it. Please join me. But when did we buy, and how are we sustaining the myth that we've raised an entire generation of ne'er-do-wells? How many of you know a teenager or two personally? Lots of you. Are they villains? I'm guessing not. Is it everybody else's rather than yours then? I guess it must be. Yes, some people are involved in the youth justice system, and we must continue to engage in even difficult decisions about them and about that system against the benchmark of the United Nations Convention. As Children's Commissioner for England, alongside those in the other jurisdictions in the UK, in ERA and in Europe, I stand for a children's rights-based approach measured against the promises in that convention. It's an area of UK practice where the UN criticises our approach to how we label and try, punish and rehabilitate, change and treat youngsters who offend. Numbers in contact with the system have started to fall, and they still have further to go. It's appropriate at this point in the new government's term of office to hold a discussion. The Lord Chancellor's welcome wish to move to a more community-based rehabilitative model is welcome. But Articles 37 and 40 of the Convention together are crucial. Between them, they say that children, remember that's under 18s, have the right to be tried in a way they understand. Their treatment in the justice system must be age appropriate, incarceration, including on remand, a matter of last resort. The details of these articles ask us to look for the social and familial reasons why offenders offend. They say society has a duty to divert them and deal with them pre-arrest rather than arresting them, again, except as a last resort. If they have infringed the law, the Convention requires that we seek the reasons as well as to punish, that we rehabilitate as well as incarcerating. It requires that children go to prison as a last resort, and that when they're anywhere in the system, they're to be shielded from treatment that you or I would consider degrading or inhuman. I've yet to read the detail of this morning's Guardian story about numbers released from incarceration who go on to kill themselves. But they are a serious community, and once I've read it, I've no doubt there will be need to comment. I'd ask that through our responses to the Justice Green Paper soon, and in whatever follows, we work to get closer to our goal of dealing differently with youngsters who offend. The change is a goal that's shared by the Ministry of Justice and the Home Office, and as it moves its work into the MOJ and stands down as a separate organisation, the Youth Justice Board. Last night, just over 2,000 children in England and Wales slept in secure accommodation behind locked doors, behind bars. Some of them were aged under 14. Some will have gone to sleep close to, others many miles from their families. Some will have committed truly heinous and horrendous crimes. They will be incarcerated because that's where they should be. They will be being punished and kept in a place of safety for their own and others' well-being. I am not saying let them loose. I am not saying let them loose. I am saying that they need to be where they are, and that in most settings, whatever their crime, they get therapy as well as containment, education and treatment. For many, they will be helped to reform their lives, and you will know that reoffending among young offenders is lower than that among adults. Some, however, will not have committed anything like such a serious offence. Many will be contained on remand. They have not yet been judged, they have not yet been sentenced. Many will have ended up where they are because of an escalation of really petty offences committed over a period of time. In the worst cases, those who were behind bars last night would have been there for 12 hours out of the day. These are children. In our secure settings in this country, children and young people can still be physically restrained, including through the infliction of pain. English children and young people in secure accommodation can be strip searched, can be placed in strip cells, which are what they sound like. Look at them in the system now. To be incarcerated in England and Wales, they can be as young as 10. Most are already known to education support, social services. 1 in 4 young offenders has been in care. If they have a parent convicted of a crime, they're 66% more likely to offend themselves. Above average within their cohort in the population will have special educational needs, including poor literacy and sometimes undiagnosed speech and language problems. So they start at a recognisable cognitive disadvantage in legal settings where specialist language, body language, dress, furniture, settings are the norm. More than their cohort's profile, they are likely to have a diagnosable mental health condition. More than their cohort's profile, they will have a dependency on drink or drugs. We know more young offenders than those in the general population have varying degrees of any or all of these difficulties, and many will experience court processes they struggle to understand. They are troubled as well as troublesome, as the staff who work with them and who talk to us acknowledge freely and openly. We're bound by international standards on youth justice, not only in the Convention, but in the Riyadh rules, in the Beijing rules, in the Havana rules. We are bound. They give us the basis for going forward. They are already in existence, and they express best practice. They're based on the notion that children and young people are vulnerable, that those who offend usually do so out of still heightened vulnerability, and that all who offend deserve to have their rights addressed by the adults in the justice system. They're further reinforced by the EU's publication on October the 14th this year of its new, and I have to say very good, guidance on child-friendly justice. It was written with close to 4,000 children and young people giving their views to its writers. I'll close with a reminder, however, of the realities you and I understand, lest you run away with the idea that as Commissioner I believe we're all deliberately and callously doing our children dreadful wrongs, or that all of them live lives as hard and worrying as those in the worst circumstances. On the contrary, most of England's 11.8 million children and young people are well parented. They are well taught in good schools. They are healthy, balanced young citizens. They live in warm, secure, and loving homes, and they are made ready to face life's challenges. Most, when they venture beyond their homes, are supported by trusted adults who understand children and work with them because they like them. Some are, of course, needier and challenged, troubled or in trouble. A very tiny minority are massively damaged, and they will harm themselves or others unless we, the adults in their lives, work to turn them round. I will go on challenging all of us to decide what to do about dealing with their problems, not just by punishing them for what we as a society have somehow failed to do to safeguard their well-being. If our big society is to bear fruit, as I'm sure all of us would wish, we need to fulfill the promises we made in 1991. And I'm asking you and me on the 20th of November to print a copy off the UNICEF website and sign it again. If we do, and if we use it to remind us to listen to and believe in our children and young people, we will enable them to be all that we would wish they are. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Maggie. We're running a little bit late, and I know people want to ask questions.
Apologies.
So I'll just ask a couple to get us started. If you can give kind of short, punchy answers, Maggie, then we'll be able to open it up to other people in the room, because what with the tube strike and everything, people need to do on time. So the title of the talk is, or the session was, Why Rights Aren't Wrong. So I want to ask a couple of questions about it. The first is, can you see a distinction between the good society, however you might define that, and the good society for children? That is to say, why do we need a separate children's agenda? Could we envisage a society that is good, that is not good for its children?
We may not be able to envisage such a society, but as civilised beings, it's my sincere belief, and always has been, that those who are voiceless need those with the power to speak on their behalf. And our children and young people, even when they are, as I described them at the end of that talk, very well parented and beautifully looked after and articulate and in fine fettle, also have weaker voices than the adults around them. And they don't learn to be adults with voices unless they are modelled, unless they have modelled for them how to exercise, how to grow that voice, how to become citizens in their own right. What I'm not saying, as I said, is that children's rights should negate the rights of adults. They have to be respectful and responsible as well as picking up their rights. They don't earn them, they're a given.
So in those terms, do you see that the primary focus of what you're doing is not so much, as it were, arguing for particular outcomes for children, because in a sense a good society would be a society that generated those outcomes. It is to focus more distinctively on a kind of process argument, which is about the importance of listening to young people in terms of defining and creating that good society. Spot on.
That's exactly what it's about. And you can't listen to them unless you are prepared to get down to their level.
Okay. So let's explore this issue of rights. We know that there is, and indeed the coalition, or the Conservatives in particular, actually, to be fair, Conservatives distinctively, I don't think the Liberal Democrats were in the same place at all on this, articulated a kind of rights backlash in the election campaign in the sense of hostility to the Human Rights Act, and that kind of contributes to a notion that rights have become a way in which lefties kind of force society to do things which it wouldn't not otherwise choose to do through legalistic means. That is to say, rather than kind of arguing for the policies, what you want to do is to have a set of regulations which force us to do things. And actually, shouldn't we just make these decisions on the pragmatic policy grounds rather than feeling that we need to be bound by something which tells us, which tries to give us rules that we have to adhere to?
But the same politicians, I think from all stripes, are also very clear and have said from pretty similar public stages in the same sort of space of time, we do recognise that if all you do is leave it to society to leaven itself, those with the sharpest elbows and the best education and the best chances are the ones who get the prize. Now, one of the things that the coalition has come in to try to do, and says at every verse end, is that it absolutely desperately wants to level that playing field and make the vulnerable and the quiet and the voiceless and the unheard and the unlistened to gain their place in the big society, in the good society, in the whatever you want to call it. And that's what I hold on to as Commissioner, that they are seriously committed, and they say so in their policies, and we will have to hold them to account as the electorate. Of course we will, all of us, and we would have done whoever had got in, all of us. We have to hold them to fulfilling that belief. And if what that means is you give a leg up to the people whose elbows are blunter, and you don't take notice all the time of the ones who always push their way to the front of the queue, then actually you do need a set of entitlements and rights that you're prepared to defend.
Okay, then finally from me, if the last criticism, or one criticism, is that rights are a kind of way of binding us down and kind of not allowing us to use our common sense to make pragmatic decisions, the alternative criticism is that, well, who could possibly disagree with all the things that you say? You know, we can all sign up to that. What does it actually mean in practice? You talked about education. How would, for example, an adherence to the convention help us with an issue like should disruptive pupils be taken out of school, which is probably deleterious to them, or should they be kept in school, even if that's deleterious to the education of the children who are forced to cope with, as it were, their disruptive behaviour? Or to give you another conundrum, if I might, and ask you whether rights help us with this. To summarise the research, there may be others in the room who argue this isn't the case, but I would summarise the research of this. Mixed schools, that is to say compulsory mixing of schools through kind of lotteries or methods which stop the process of social sorting in schools, which we've seen over the last few years. It appears to be the general effect is that is good for children as a whole, because it improves the life chances of working class children. It's probably actually slightly bad for middle class children. It's probably better for middle class children if they can colonise the best schools than going to mixed schools. So there's a kind of slight conflict of interest there. In relation to either of those issues, which are children versus other children, do does the convention, does your rights approach help us know the answer to those questions?
I'll give you an anecdote from a live school to answer the first part of that, Matthew. Quite early on in my term, I went to Hampshire to visit 2 of the UNICEF rights respecting schools. And one was a secondary school in a very difficult bit of the county with a very mobile population on the edge of naval Gosport, not easy territory. Sunday, one of my press officers was with me. These were youngsters who were streetwise, weren't they? They were sus. They were absolutely in there. They were, you know, pierced in places where you might not have understood that piercings ought to be, and all the rest of it. They were not. This was not easy street. This was a difficult place, and it was run by an astounding white South African political refugee who'd come with the United Nations Convention burned in him because of the South African experience. And he'd walked into a situation where he freely admitted there was anarchy, basically, on the corridors, difficult stuff. And he determinedly walked the convention into the middle of that school. It no longer excludes, it's oversubscribed, its exam results have gone up, its attendance has gone up, bullying has fallen, staff turnover has fallen, because, and it was the kids who told us this, what you've got to understand is that we're a family. And if I push him out of the way, how is that gaining me my rights? It's just pushing him out of the way. They were perfectly able to explain that the adoption of a United Nations Convention-based approach to everything they did on the sports field, on the bus home, on the playing areas, in the classroom, in the way they talked to adults, had changed the school. And there were 16-year-olds who'd been there when he first arrived who said, it won't like this 5 years ago. Now, if it works in a place like that, it flipping well ought to be able to work everywhere, in my opinion. It's about bravery, because the conversations between the adults and the children in that school, the discourse was different. It was mutually respectful. I will give you the space to talk to me because I want to learn, and I'm not going to diss you and do you down as a teacher, because how is that respecting your rights? They don't do it. Now, that for me is burning stuff. Now, in terms of if there's a lottery and you even out the playing field, for me, you're asking the question from the wrong end of the telescope. As a former teacher, I would say that the mission of the nation has to be that you shouldn't have to fight to get into the good school, because we ought to be working to make all of them learn from each other. This is what Mr. Gove's Free School and Academies principles are about. It's what the previous government's Academies programme was about. Schools learning from schools, whether or not there is a local authority in the middle of it. And I'm a former chief inspector in a local authority, so I think there ought to be, because I think somebody has to hold the moral reins. Somebody has to say, I know you don't want to take him because he's a kid in care and he's been involved with the youth justice system. I'm directing you to admit. Now, I don't know who's going to do that in a system that gets more and more and more diverse. And that's why I said, let's keep an eye on what happens. These are our schools. If we are the big society, these are our schools. And these are our children. All of them. Especially the ones who are most difficult.